there is a way forward. We haven't reached the precipice yet, and there's a way of charting a new course between the major powers as well as with the mid-sized powers and smaller nations like ourselves. It requires first and foremost stabilization. Just avoid dialing up the tensions, avoid further steps, avoid escalation that then becomes self-reinforcing. So that's the first order of business. But second, there's so much common interest between the US and China and between all nations in the biggest challenges we face: climate change, pandemic preparedness, and just getting growth going. Those are the biggest challenges we face, which affect the well-being of our own populations. And focusing bilateral and multilateral efforts around those large challenges in a mission-driven way, tackle pandemic preparedness, create multivalent vaccines, tackle carbon capture, clean steel, clean cement, the whole range of innovations that are still out there, still at the boundaries of what's possible and not yet viable, but invest in it. There's a whole range of investments that are in the mutual interest that we have to collaborate on. And that itself forms an overarching relationship between the major powers who will otherwise be obsessed with competition and obsessed with what divides them. Thirdly, there's also scope, I think, to do some dialing down, many small moves that could reduce tension. I mean, if you look at, objectively speaking, if you look at much of the tariff war that has taken place, it's not been in anyone's interest. It's not in the interest of American workers, not in the interest of American manufacturing, not in the interest of China, not in the interest of Singapore and the smaller nations. So there's an opportunity to dial down in everyone's interest. So it requires that new understanding, and I think there's a very important new start yesterday in the meeting between the President Biden and President Xi. There's an opportunity for a new understanding, but it then requires actions. Avoid further escalation, find ways to dial down, but also start exploiting this very large terrain of mutual interests that require collaborative investments, public and private, and using as best as we can the multilateral institutions. They are valuable institutions, particularly the World Bank and the MDBs. We are underusing them. By using them to catalyze private finance, we can actually go quite some distance to addressing that large-scale investment challenge that we have in the next 10 years. We have to recognize that China is not the Soviet Union during the Cold War. China will continue to be a growing and emerging economy, and it will develop capabilities. You can slow the development of those capabilities, particularly in advanced semiconductors and a few other areas, but you can't prevent China from emerging as a major player in the global economy and in the global technology space. The question is whether you eventually want China as a formidable economy to be distrustful of you, to be in a relationship of antagonism, or whether you want interdependence. And that requires drawing careful lines around what is really required to protect national security, what is something you can allow to have continued exchange and interdependence on, but you watch and you verify, some element of trust and verify, and what you have open competition on. It requires some clear lines and a clear framework that draws those lines. I believe it is possible. I don't think the US is set on a course of collision with China, despite some of the noise you may hear. I believe it is possible to formulate this framework, and it is possible to then cooperate on the much larger challenges that both China and the US and the rest of the multinational economy, the global the community faces. No one can be naive about national security anywhere. And it requires some restrictions on economic activity, some components, some software, some investments. But there's another fundamental idea that we have to recognize, even from the point of view of national security, which is that an economically interdependent world and an economically interdependent US and China is also in the national security interest. And the way to recognize that is just, just think very simply. Just go through the thought experiment. Imagine a world where China and the US are decoupled in trade, investment, data, payments, financial systems, intellectual property creation. That would be a profoundly dangerous world. A profoundly dangerous world. So interdependence is not going to assure us of peace. There'll be constant friction. The move towards a multipolar world was never going to be frictionless, but it's much safer than a world that's decoupled. So I would take that same attitude when we think about friendshoring and the like. Avoid decoupled alliances of friends as well. Go as much as we can for overlapping alliances. And whether it's the CPTPP or the RCEP or the other alliances that we are forming, keep them overlapping. And you'll notice that Singapore and several other Southeast Asian countries are in both sets of alliances. And we must keep it that way. We must grow it. Hold out the hope that both the China and the US are eventually going to be part of these trading alliances. Hold out that hope and leave the door open.